Translating music from games into live performance. Sometimes music doesn't translate well to full orchestra, but other times they do. I wholeheartedly agree with you. It's a really interesting thing how there's a lot of things about music in video games that really works well within the context of video game. And one of the problems sometimes is when we use these VSTs and these MIDI files and these sort of, we're on our computers composing, we're not necessarily at a piano. It doesn't always translate super well to orchestra. And that can be really frustrating for those of us that like going to live performances, because sometimes things don't really line up. And it's also why some things are really hard to program. A prime example of this would be the Genshin Impact concert. I would have loved to have heard the Scaramouche battle theme at this Genshin Impact concert, and we've seen it live. We've seen it recorded with an orchestra on stage, and it works, but a lot of the technical limitations from that come from that EDM soundscape, which is very we can do it in a concert setting, but it struggles, I think, from a professional perspective live. Another prime example is Ascension from Final Fantasy 16. Okay, Ascension, one of the most glorious pieces of music I've ever listened to when it comes to the evolution of classical music. It is the defining feature of Bach, and it sounds like Bach. But the problem is that piece is so long. It's 16-ish minutes, give or take, with all the action that's happening, and the action is really, really just so incredible. Now, the problem is when you translate it to orchestra, and I went to a Distant Worlds concert and I saw it performed on Distant Worlds. What ended up happening is that it just sort of ended up lasting too long. There was no through line melodically, because it ends up being noise, or it ends up being repeated so many times due to action. If it's not transcribed and shifted specifically for the performance of an orchestra, it actually starts to lose some of its muscle. Now, that being said, there are plenty of pieces of music from Guild Wars 2, from the Elder Scrolls Online, from Halo, from Bloodborne, from hundreds of other different games that translate unbelievably well to orchestra. I mean, look at any Mario or Zelda game. Those songs translate so well to big band, to jazz, to orchestra, to swing, to any sort of variation, to opera, any sort of variation. Those motifs and those themes work really well. And part of the reason for that, I believe, is because of the melodic emphasis, which is something I really harp on in my day-to-day discussions about video game music, is that melody makes it so that it's actually easily transcribable when we then get to perform that on an orchestra stage, which is really, really, really cool. Now, also another prime example would be Toho. There's a video I watched of a pianist playing a Toho piece for a piano competition, which is it's crazy. And that music is so MIDI. It's so done on a synthesizer, on a computer. And so it's pretty fascinating how music and translating it from the comfort of our homes and our computers to then transporting it to orchestra, how different that experience can be. I think it takes a lot of managing and looking at pieces and saying, okay, well, how do I do this and how do I do that? And also arrangers, because a lot of things are better arranged if someone can then take a piece and be like, oh, you know what? For a performance, we want this to be 5 minutes. We want this to be 10 minutes. Let me just snip, snip, snip here, do this, do that, do that. A prime example of something that's really cool is Final Symphony 2. Final Symphony 1 and 2 are symphonic programs that take the music from Final Fantasy and they transform them. They transform them into these beautiful piano concertos, these tone poems. Final Symphony is a concert series officially licensed by Square Enix, featuring symphonic music from the video games of Final Fantasy 6, 7, and 10, and now they do 9, 13. Originally composed by Uematsu and Hamauzu, the creative director and producer of the World Tour is Thomas Booker, and it's pretty cool because we essentially, and I've noticed this too in I was listening to Final Fantasy Rebirth soundtrack as I prepare for my end of the year video game music thoughts. And one of the things that I noticed that's really cool is the difference between Uematsu and Hamauzu. And if you don't know the difference, it's really fascinating because Uematsu is such an amazing composer because he writes melodically first. And so it doesn't necessarily have a lot of texture. When we talk about texture, we talk about if melody is this big, texture makes it this big. We're adding instrumentation, we're adding size, we're adding volume, we're adding color, we're adding tone. And Hamauzu does an incredible, I mean, Hamauzu is a classical composer that happens to write for video game music, right? And it's so fascinating to hear the pieces from Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, or really Final Fantasy 13 is another prime example, and which is composed by Hamauzu, and hearing how he takes those thematic ideas from Uematsu and transforms them and makes them super dense, super dynamic, and super interesting. And I think enhances them in a lot of ways. So a good arranger can really, really make or break a live performance experience. And I think that that's sometimes why a piece that we maybe will hear in a video game doesn't always translate well to the concert hall. Guild Wars 2 music, perfect for the concert hall. Doesn't need anything because the pieces are pretty short-ish. They have usually an exposition, or they're painting an emotional experience, or they're showcasing like a dynamic or an emotion, or a color, a tone color, which is a really big thing too in classical music. And so those work really well. Of course, Bethesda games work really well orchestrally, especially when we think of the music of Inan Zur, we think of Skyrim, we think of even Starfield. The Starfield Suite is a prime example of something that just like works really well in a classical setting. You've got stuff like Lost Ark, which works really well in a classical setting, Bloodborne, any of the FromSoft stuff for the most part. One piece that I remember listening to in a live concert was the Overwatch main theme, and I was like, this does not work live, like at all. No, it was the character select. It was awful. It was an encore too, and I was like, I don't think that this should be an encore. This just does not work well. I'd really like to check out the Sonic Symphony music, because that's something that kind of surprises me, that we could then take Sonic music, transpose it for a symphony, and then present that. Like, that's crazy. That's something I really want to sit down and listen to, because it's like, how do you take this bright, colorful music and then put it in a classical setting and present it? That's something just so fascinating. It's something I really want to listen to. So it's a great question. It's a great question. You know, sometimes music doesn't translate well to full orchestra, but other times it does. And why does it do that? And I don't have all the answers, but that's certainly the things that come to mind right away.